Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. I'm your host today, Ian Fisher, and we've got a really wonderful show that's lined up for you, talking a little bit about students who are applying to and attending college with learning differences and disabilities. So we're going to approach this from a variety of different perspectives in the three different segments that we have covered today. We will cover a little bit from a financial aid perspective around how students with disabilities might be able to apply for and earn scholarships that they are especially eligible for. We will be speaking with a student who is a current college student who has CP and uses a service dog to get around campus, and hear a little bit about her story, which I'm very excited for. But we're going to start in our first conversation with an old friend of mine, Vanessa Garrido, who is a Reed College alumna, also an alumna of the Reed College Admission Office, and currently a colleague of mine out here on the West Coast at College Coach. Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Ian. Happy to be here.
I'm glad to have you here. And I know that talking a little bit about supporting students with many different kinds of differences, whether it's learning differences or disabilities, is something that you are especially passionate about, that you are especially expert in. And so we're going to tap that expertise today and talk just a little bit about how students should approach these kinds of conversations and navigate what is already a complex process with an understanding of what their own particular needs are. Before we do that, before we jump into questions, and I'm talking too much already, but I have to point people to our website, blog.getintocollege.com, where you can go to our blog and you can find this wonderful post that Vanessa has written all about students who are applying to college with disabilities, some of the things that they should keep an eye out for, some of the particular modes of support that colleges can provide, different checklists. There's a lot of very interesting terminology in there. So it helps students, I think, to know what kinds of questions to ask. But Vanessa, I want to start with something just like super simple. For students who are out there who have any kind of a learning difference or disability, what would your advice be to them as they are beginning the process of applying for college? What's just the initial thing that you would want them to understand as they're beginning to navigate questions that they may have about higher education?
Yeah, so just to start off, I would say to think about this as an additional layer of research that you'll be doing when you're doing your college search process, and that it's going to be a really big part of the fit piece for you. So,
Yeah.
when we think about fit, we usually think about the academic components, the social components, financial fit, and this is sort of an additional layer that can cross-sect with those things. But you want to reflect on your own experience and how you've been successful navigating things so far and what has benefited you in that process, and try to find those same supports in the colleges that you're looking for. So your research that you've done can lend itself really nicely to your research that you're going to do in this process.
And I think that's great advice. When we think a little bit about disabilities, learning differences, it's such an enormous spectrum of differences that people have that need to be understood in different kinds of ways. And so can you help to understand some of the things that maybe might clue a student in that they need to be doing this extra level of research? I mean, I think there are some things that are more apparent to students that they're going to be having to do this, like, for students who are having difficulty physically getting around campus, who are maybe in a wheelchair, they have to look at accessibility. That's something you can see, but then there are other differences that are maybe unseen or that students might not be acknowledging. But just to give people a sense of what we're talking about here, how would you describe some examples?
Yeah, and oftentimes we'll call these invisible disabilities, and they can manifest in many different ways. As you said, there's lots of breadth there.
Yeah.
In terms of learning disabilities, students might have dyslexia or dyscalculia or things that kind of affect their academic abilities there, maybe ADHD or attention related issues there. So in terms of when they have been diagnosed, that also can span a huge amount of time. So for students who are more recently diagnosed, the process of researching these supports is going to be maybe concurrent because it's happening more recently. But for those who have already found supports that have functioned well for them in high school, they can often connect with their support team, like the folks who have helped them with their IEP or individualized education plan. And they oftentimes have supports built into that IEP already. So one thing I also always suggest at this stage, especially for sophomores and juniors, just to make sure your documents are going to be updated. When you're going to be applying to schools, they're going to often want to see about 3 years or less for updated documents. So that's something that I always recommend, having those documents updated by medical professionals as well.
You mentioned IEPs, and there are 504s as well, and there are different expectations that a family might have for what a high school has to provide versus what a college may be able to provide. And I think that some of that navigation is important for families to understand. One of the things that we talked about internally when we were at our team meeting in January was that the responsibility to advocate sort of shifts from the parent in the high school context to the student in the college context, that the student needs to find out a way to be their own self-advocate. What are some recommendations that you would give to students as they're making that move from high school to college to practice advocacy for themselves, to be able to ask for that kind of support that they may need and are entitled to, frankly?
Absolutely. Great question. So I think oftentimes taking ownership over the process of researching and connecting with support services, both at the high school level and in the research process for college, I think that can be a great way to start the advocacy process. Just, connecting with offices of disability services, which those names can vary a little bit. It might be the disability service office, but just kind of researching the different opportunities at the schools that they're excited about and leading the process, leading that charge. Connecting, trying to maybe even find students at those colleges that they can chat with and get a little bit more insight if they've used services at the college and they can learn about that. Oftentimes that even begins with the admission office. If a student reaches out to the admission office first and inquires if they can be connected to the disability service office, or if there are students who kind of work in both spaces, like as interns, and maybe can lend some insights about what has been beneficial to them at the school.
There is often, unfortunately, I think, stigma that's attached with different kinds of disabilities that people may be experiencing. I think people are getting better at talking about these things and talking about what they need. But there are some students who are still reluctant to share, who may be reluctant to ask for accommodations, even if they are entitled to those accommodations. Is there any just general coaching that you would give for a student who is coming to grips with maybe a more recent diagnosis, and help them to understand, like, hey, this is all right. This is part of a difference that you experience, and we got to figure out a way to make a more equitable approach to your education?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a student's disability is part of their diversity. It's part of what they'd be bringing to the community and diversifying and empowering others who also have disabilities. So I hope they feel they can embrace that part of who they are and seek the services that will help them succeed. I think that it's also important to acknowledge sharing or disclosing this information in the admission process is very different from finding out information and researching support systems through the disability service offices. So not feeling like it has to be paired. It's really a different process. So when a student is seeking this information, looking at the ODS websites or even visiting those offices on campus, it's not something that they necessarily need to disclose in the admission process. That's a separate decision that they can reflect on and decide if it's right for them.
And that is a complex decision. And I think, we've been in admissions committees where we've had conversations like this. We have been having conversations like this at College Coach. And I think it's just, the more info you have about a student, I think the harder it is to make a decision. And so for students who are trying to figure out what they want to provide in their application, it is a very individualized conversation that you may want to have as a family, with a counselor, with an expert, to decide, what do I disclose here? What do I want? What do I want the admission office to know about me? And what do I not need them to know about me because they're not specifically asking for it? So that is a conversation I hope that we'll be able to have on a future show. For now, I want to switch gears a little bit to talking about what kinds of research specifically you would recommend students do. So let's get them situated in a position where they can start to check things off a to-do list. Maybe they've got a list of items that they're looking for. How would we support students in getting organized as they're researching different colleges here?
Yeah. So just to begin, I want to advocate and support for students embracing the research process and just understanding that it's only going
Please.
to
Yes.
strengthen
Yes.
their approach and their ability to connect with the services that they need and the people that they can find information from. So creating a to-do list is essential, and it can start with the most basic types of things like, essentially creating some kind of ranking system and deciding what accommodations specifically are going to be the most beneficial for them to succeed. And when they're looking at different schools, creating a rank. So, A through F or 1 through 5. How does this specific school that I'm really excited about, address the needs that I'm going to be requiring to be supported and successful here? So that piece is really important. Also connecting with other professionals and members of their support team and just kind of clarifying where am I going to be able to get the most support in what ways? So letters of recommendation. Is this something that my teachers are going to be addressing in their letters of recommendation and my counselor? Are they going to talk about my disability? Is that something that I feel comfortable with, or is that something I'd rather them not talk about? So it's all about communication, as well as with medical professionals. So again, about getting those documents updated. That's going to really just smooth out the process down the road to have everything updated, relevant. So the to-do list is really kind of connecting with others who are going to help students throughout the process.
And you're describing a to-do list that I think includes both what students are doing from the application side, but then also what they're doing in terms of vetting these different institutions that they're going to consider. And I'm curious from that research perspective, there are mixed ideas about what the role of a visit is for a college, what the role of online research looks like for students with disabilities. Do they need to go and see the place? Do they need to connect with the potential professionals that they're going to be connecting with when they're asking for accommodations? Or can they do a bulk of their research online? What is the availability of this information that students should expect to have access to both remotely and in person?
So definitely online research is an essential place to begin because, as we know, visits can be expensive, difficult to arrange, depending on everyone's proximity to the schools of interest and things like that too. So starting with online research is really great way to begin, and just simple things like looking up the name of the school online followed by the term Office of Disability Services and just looking at the website and seeing, oftentimes they'll even have a list of accommodations there, or you can get a look at the staff. How large is it? How diverse is it? Do they have contact info where you can call them directly, or do you have to email them? Setting up an appointment with them maybe before a visit just to get a little bit more insight if that piece is going to be a good fit. I think that that's all really important work, kind of pre-work for a visit. When possible, though, a visit can be incredibly helpful as well, especially for students with mobility issues or just wanting to make sure that classrooms are accessible, that ramps are available, things like that. So when possible, a visit can add an extra layer, but the pre-work is really essential in helping decide that.
Now, we've talked a little bit in the past around structured and unstructured kinds of programs. There are things that schools have to do by law because of the ADA in order to provide support for students with disabilities. That's kind of the minimum bar. And I think schools have different interpretations about what is necessary and how to be compliant with the ADA. So you have some schools that are better than others from an unstructured perspective, but there are also some schools out there that have more structured programs in place. How can students find these if that's something that they're looking for? And what are the questions that they can ask about a more structured program, especially for learning disabilities?
So the structured programs are usually listed directly on the website as well. And there's also
Okay.
great guides like the KNW guide that often will have those structured programs clarified there.
Yeah.
Oftentimes structured programs, they're more involved in terms of the application process. So they might even require an additional application process that can be pretty in-depth. They might have additional essays, maybe an interview component. There are often fees associated with those. So that's definitely worth the research because the programs can be very robust and supportive in many ways, where there might be affinity groups related, peer support. It's not necessarily just that kind of a la carte pick and choose. It's really developed and robust, but there are also oftentimes fees, and it can be a
Yeah.
bigger commitment there.
Yeah. I think like with everything that you're saying, it sounds to me like, the search process for students with disabilities is pretty similar to what it is for every student. And maybe they even benefit a little bit more from the more intensive research that they might be doing because they're asking the fit question, perhaps with a greater sense of the reality on campus, which I think not a lot of students will do in most cases. It's like, what does my life look like every day? How am I going to get help when I need help in class? That's a question every student should be asking. And I think that these students who are especially primed to ask these questions are likely to find good answers and perhaps be on the right path towards a great fit. Are there other final recommendations? We want to send people to read your blog post on our website. And so I think you can just go to the blog page and search for Vanessa Garrido, and you should be able to find all of the stuff that she's authored for us, including this one. But in addition to going and reading that as homework, any other final recommendations that you would make for students who are looking at schools from this particular perspective?
I think just really, again, kind of embracing the communication point with your own team, the network that you've developed over time, teachers who have supported you, family members, remembering that you've become an expert at this stage. So just really kind of tapping into what you've developed as you've gotten to know your own diagnoses and what helps you bloom and kind of blossom, be as strong as you can.
It's great to hear you say that. And you've repeated that again and again. And it reminds me of something that we talked about when we were in the admission office at Reed, was that the greatest predictor for success for students on our campus was the number of contact points that they had with adults throughout their college experience, and especially a willingness to ask for help. It had nothing to do with how smart they were before they came in. It was about what they did when they inevitably met with some difficulty. And you are repeating that loudly for all students. And I want to make sure that we underline that, because making use of your network and finding people who can support you and tapping them, I think, is really, really key, especially for students with disabilities, but frankly, for all students as well.
Agreed, 100%.
Awesome. Well, I think it's easy for us to agree, but that doesn't mean that it's not great advice. Vanessa, thank you so much for coming on the show today. How is out in Walla Walla, is spring starting to show up? Are you seeing the crocuses pop? Are we getting there?
We're
How do you feel
getting
about
there. The snow
we're
has
getting there?
melted, so
The
we're
snow
moving in
is,
the right direction. Yes.
it is a start. We're directionally headed towards spring. We're starting to feel it a little bit here. We got a sunny day. We've got out in Portland, we've got maybe we might hit the 60s this weekend.
I thought I saw some sun come in through the window.
Yeah, a little bit of sun's coming. You know what it's like when we get those sunny
It's
days
huge.
out here. People just go absolutely wild. And Portlandia is a little bit of an exaggeration, but there's one sketch about the sun moving and people just
Following it
going
everywhere.
crazy. That one is pretty
that.
accurate. So folks want to check that out. Vanessa, we have to bond a little bit over Portland, of course. Thanks for coming on the show. That was great. When we come back, we will be speaking with a student currently about what her time has been like in college. And so we are excited to share. Don't go away.